Most people believe that death arrives in silence, an invisible moment, a final breath, a medical fact buried inside a chart. But they're wrong. At least, that's what one doctor discovered on the night he saw something no medical school could ever prepare him for, the presence that comes before the last heartbeat. A luminous figure standing in a hospital hallway, waiting, watching, guiding. And that moment shattered everything he thought he knew about life, death, and what exists beyond the edge of human understanding. What if the dying are never truly alone? What if someone, or something, always comes for them? And what if the people who work closest to death have been sensing it all along, but never dared to speak? This is not a legend, not a myth, not a ghost story told in the dark. These are real experiences from hospital rooms where the veil between worlds grows thin, and where a doctor's unexpected gift reveals truths we pretend not to see. If you've ever wondered what truly happens in the final moments of life, prepare yourself. This story will change the way you see every goodbye, every last breath, every quiet moment in a hospital corridor. And the ending reveals a truth so powerful, so comforting, that you may never fear death the same way again. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. And as you listen, keep one thing in mind. Some doors don't close, they open. The hospital that night felt less like a place of healing and more like a storm swallowing everything in its path. Stretchers rolled in nonstop, paramedics shouted vitals, and machines beeped with the urgency of fading time. The doctor, exhausted after 20 relentless hours on duty, moved through the chaos like someone navigating underwater. But then something broke the pattern. At the far end of the corridor, untouched by the frenzy around him, stood a stillness so absolute that it didn't belong to that world. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment would tear a seam in the fabric of everything he believed. He blinked hard, convinced it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. But when his eyes focused again, the figure remained, unmoving, serene, glowing with a soft light that didn't seem to come from any source he recognized. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was calming, almost warm, as if the figure carried its own quiet universe. The contrast was surreal. In a place where the air pulsed with urgency, this presence stood as calm as the center of a hurricane. And the doctor felt, instinctively, that the figure wasn't there by accident. Trying to steady his breath, he took a few uncertain steps forward. Each footstep echoed louder than it should, as if the hallway itself were stretching. The closer he got, the more details he noticed. The figure's edges shimmered like heat rising off asphalt, and it didn't move, not even to acknowledge him. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't indifferent either. It was like watching someone wait at a train station for an arrival only they knew about. Then a chill ran through him. The luminous presence wasn't simply in the hallway. It was positioned directly in front of room 03, the room where a patient was fighting through his final breaths. The alignment was too perfect to ignore. And in that instant, a part of the doctor that had always lived in rational certainty felt a crack. He didn't want to believe what his mind was suggesting, but his body recognized something ancient, something instinctive. Before he could step closer, a monitor from room 03 let out a long, steady tone, flatline. At that exact second, the figure slowly turned its head toward the door, as if responding to a silent call. The doctor froze, unable to move, unable to speak. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Not yet. But one thought echoed louder than the alarms around him. What if this presence wasn't there to cause death, but to escort it? And that question would follow him long after that night refused to fade. The poet arrived at the hospital with the fragile calm of someone who had already made peace with things most people fear. Even in his weakened body, there was an elegance in the way he spoke, choosing his words as if each one were a final verse. The doctor noticed immediately, this man carried stories in his eyes, entire worlds pressed between moments. And yet, beneath that serenity, there was a quiet anticipation, as if he were waiting for something only he could sense. As the night deepened, the poet asked the doctor to stay a little longer by his bedside. His voice was soft, but clear enough to spill a single confession. She promised she'd come for me. The doctor assumed he meant a family member, maybe someone traveling from far away. But the poet's smile said otherwise. It wasn't the smile of someone expecting a visitor from this world. It was the smile of someone remembering a promise from long ago, one woven into the kind of love that outlives time. The doctor felt the atmosphere shift before anything visible happened. The air grew warmer, almost hums with a vibration he couldn't explain. The poet turned his head slightly, eyes fixed on a corner of the room where nothing, at least to the doctor's eyes, stood. But the doctor knew that sensation too well now. The presence was unmistakable, calm, luminous, familiar. And the poet whispered, almost relieved, "You kept your word." The doctor felt a shiver, not from fear, but from witnessing something profoundly intimate. As the poet's breath slowed, the light in the corner seemed to respond, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The doctor couldn't see a face, or features, only a warmth shaped like devotion. The poet reached out a trembling hand, not towards the doctor, but toward the presence waiting for him. And for a moment, the doctor could almost swear he saw another hand reaching back, formed not of flesh, but of memory and love. It wasn't death approaching. It was a reunion. When the poet finally exhaled his last breath, the room didn't feel empty. Instead, it felt complete, as though a circle had just closed with flawless timing. The luminous presence remained for a few seconds longer, as if giving the doctor a silent nod, an acknowledgement, a thank you, or perhaps an invitation to understand more. And just like that, it faded gently, leaving behind a peace so palpable that the doctor knew this moment would haunt, not with fear, but with beauty, every belief he ever held about what waited beyond the veil. The doctor had spent weeks wondering if he was losing his mind. Every new presence he sensed, every subtle shift in the room before a patient's passing, made him question whether he should speak up or stay silent. But silence began to weigh on him. One night, after another inexplicable encounter, he found himself in the break room with 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist, people hardened by experience, not easily shaken. Still, something in the air made him take the risk. Do you ever feel something? Right before a patient goes? The room froze. The nurses exchanged glances that were too quick, too loaded with meaning to be coincidence. It was the respiratory therapist who finally broke the tension. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it. Instead, he exhaled slowly and said, "You mean the shift in the air? The feeling like someone else walks in?" The doctor's heart jolted. They weren't mocking him. They were describing exactly what he had been witnessing. For the first time, he wasn't alone in the madness he feared was his own creation. One of the nurses leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. She confessed that every time a certain patient neared the end, she felt a soft pressure on her shoulder, as if someone stood behind her. Another admitted she saw shadows move with purpose, shadows that didn't match any source of light. These weren't fantasies. These were seasoned professionals who had seen the worst humanity could endure, yet they spoke of these moments with reverence, not fear. Their voices trembled not from horror, but from the honesty of long-held secrets finally released. The doctor felt a strange mix of relief and dread. If others experienced the same phenomenon, it meant he wasn't imagining it. But it also meant that something real, something far beyond medical science, was unfolding around them regularly. And the more they talked, the clearer it became. Each experience was different, but the pattern was undeniable. Right before death, the room changed. The atmosphere shifted. The invisible became almost tangible. And not one of them had ever dared to speak about it. What stunned the doctor most wasn't the stories themselves, but the looks on their faces afterward. It was the look of people who had carried a truth in silence for far too long. He realized they all shared the same unspoken fear, that admitting these experiences would cost them their credibility, their careers, maybe even their sanity. Yet there they were, united in confession, finally acknowledging what their hearts had known all along. Death was never truly a solitary event. And this revelation marked the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. It began with a patient everyone in the hospital adored, a retired teacher who greeted every visitor with the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime shaping young minds. Her condition had worsened quickly, and the team knew she didn't have long. The doctor felt the familiar shift before he even entered her room. The air thickened with an almost gentle gravity, the kind that told him he wasn't walking in alone. And this time, the presence wasn't singular. There were several, quiet, patient, almost forming a circle around her bed, as if preparing for something sacred. The teacher's family had been called, but they were hours away. Panic began to swell inside the doctor. He didn't want her to leave the world alone. But as he stepped closer, he felt a strange calm wash through him, as though those unseen companions were whispering, "Don't rush. They'll make it." It made no logical sense. Her vitals were dropping steadily. Still, something held her there, like a soft, loving grip anchoring her just long enough for what needed to happen. Minutes later, her daughter phoned in tears. "We're stuck in traffic, please don't let her go yet," she begged. The doctor wanted to promise something he had no right to guarantee. But when he looked toward the invisible circle surrounding the bed, the answer came not in words, but in an overwhelming feeling, reassurance. He squeezed the daughter's hand through the phone and simply said, "Keep coming." For the next 40 minutes, the teacher's body defied every medical expectation. She held on, breath by fragile breath, as if waiting for a cue. When her family finally rushed into the room, something extraordinary happened. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. She recognized each face instantly, a final burst of presence blooming where only decline should have existed. The doctor stepped back, sensing the spirits tighten their circle, not to take her, but to create space for love to rush in one last time. The room filled with laughter, tears, whispered thank yous, a perfect farewell no medical chart could ever explain. Only after the last embrace, the last "we love you," did the teacher exhale one final, peaceful breath. And as the monitor fell silent, the circle of luminous presences slowly dissolved into the air, like mist retreating at sunrise. The doctor stood wordless, knowing exactly what he had witnessed, not death stealing someone away, but a guided, intentional farewell given shape by something unseen yet profoundly compassionate. It was the moment he realized the hospital wasn't just a place where lives ended. It was a place where transitions were orchestrated with a tenderness no human hand could imitate. The first time the doctor tried to warn a family, his voice nearly broke. He had always been trained to rely on data, scans, vitals, evidence. But now there was something else guiding him, something he could feel long before the monitors confirmed decline. And telling a family that the end was near felt like stepping across a line he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross. Still, when he approached the patient's relatives, they sensed the weight in his posture before he even spoke. Their eyes hardened with fear, but softened with the hope of honesty. Some families reacted with disbelief, gripping onto the idea that medicine could fix anything if they pushed hard enough. They questioned him, demanded numbers, demanded certainty. But even in their panic, the doctor felt compassion. How could he blame them for wanting more time? Yet, what struck him most was that when he gently explained why he felt the end was approaching, not just medically but intuitively, they didn't recoil. They listened. Even if they didn't fully understand, they recognized sincerity in his voice. Other families responded with a kind of heartbreaking acceptance. They cried openly, held on to each other, and thanked him for preparing them. These moments were quieter but heavier. They were the families who had watched the slow unraveling of someone they loved and had been waiting for a sign, any sign, that it was time to gather close. And when the doctor told them, he became the bridge between fear and closure. Their gratitude often left him speechless, because he knew the truth. He wasn't the one giving the message. He was simply delivering it. There were also families who felt something themselves before he spoke. They would say things like, "The room feels different today," or "She looks like she's already halfway somewhere else." These moments were uncanny, almost synchronistic. It was as if the invisible presences the doctor sensed were gently preparing the relatives too, weaving intuition into their hearts so the goodbye wouldn't blindside them. And when he confirmed their instincts, the relief on their faces was profound. They no longer felt crazy for sensing what couldn't be explained. But the reactions that stayed with the doctor the longest were the ones marked by transformation. Families who, upon hearing his warning, suddenly shifted from fear to devotion. They held hands, forgave old arguments, whispered memories into the patient's ear, filled the room with love so raw it felt like electricity. More than once, The doctor caught a glimpse of a luminous presence lingering nearby during these moments, almost encouraging them. It taught him that a well-timed warning wasn't just information, it was a gift. A final chance to say what truly mattered before a moment that could never be repeated. Rumors spread faster in hospitals than infections ever could. At first, only a handful of nurses knew about the doctor's unusual sensitivity. Then a few therapists. Then a surgeon who overheard a whispered conversation. It wasn't long before the stories reached the wrong ears. Administrators who valued order over truth, reputation over reality. When the doctor was called into the medical board's office, he stepped inside with the sinking feeling of someone walking into a courtroom, not a workplace. The air was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. The board members didn't waste time. They asked pointed questions under the guise of concern, but their tone revealed something harsher: fear of the unknown. They accused him, indirectly at first, of influencing families emotionally, of offering unscientific explanations, of stepping outside the boundaries of medical protocol. The doctor tried to explain that he never claimed anything supernatural, that he only shared intuition when it helped families prepare. But every word he spoke seemed to dig the hole deeper. They weren't interested in understanding. They wanted compliance. One of the board members leaned forward with a thin, rehearsed smile and said, "You must refrain from speaking about sensations." The pause before the last word was deliberate, laced with condescension. Another suggested mandatory psychological evaluation, phrased as a support resource, though everyone in the room knew the real purpose: discredit him before he could threaten the institution's facade of rational control. The doctor felt heat rise in his chest, not anger, but a kind of sorrow. They weren't trying to protect patients. They were trying to protect themselves from anything they couldn't measure. The meeting escalated when they presented him with a document requiring his signature, a statement affirming he would no longer discuss non-medical perceptions with families or staff. Signing it meant betraying every family he had helped. Refusing meant risking suspension. The board waited in silence, as if expecting him to fold under pressure. But something inside him, something shaped by every luminous presence he had seen, every peaceful farewell he had witnessed, kept him from reaching for the pen. He knew what he had experienced. And no signature could erase truth. When he walked out of the room without signing, he expected punishment. But instead, something unexpected happened. Several staff members stood waiting in the hallway, their expressions a mix of defiance and solidarity. Word had spread, not in whispers this time, but in support. They told him privately that if the board tried to silence him, they'd speak up too. And that moment revealed something powerful. The board might control the rules, but they didn't control the truth. The doctor realized then that his gift wasn't just his burden to carry. It was something the hospital needed, whether leadership admitted it or not. It started quietly, an offhand comment from a seasoned nurse during a late-night shift. She mentioned seeing a shadow move across a room just moments before a patient passed, then quickly brushed it off as fatigue. But the doctor heard the tremble in her voice, the kind that comes from speaking a truth you've swallowed for years. When he gently asked if it had happened before, she froze, then nodded. That single moment cracked something open in the halls of the hospital. Over the next few days, more confessions surfaced. A young resident admitted that he always felt a sudden drop in temperature, sharp and unmistakable, right before a patient took their final breath. A veteran ICU nurse revealed she sometimes caught the faint scent of perfume or tobacco in rooms where no one had entered for hours, as if loved ones long gone were arriving ahead of time. They spoke hesitantly at first, with the shame of people expecting to be ridiculed. But the doctor listened without judgment, and that changed everything. Once the floodgates opened, stories poured out like a hidden language finally being spoken aloud. A respiratory therapist told him she had seen a terminal patient smile at someone invisible just seconds before passing, and the expression held such pure recognition that she cried afterward. A surgeon confessed he had once felt a hand on his back during a trauma case, steadying him even though the room was empty. These weren't the fantasies of inexperienced staff. These were the testimonies of professionals forged in life-and-death reality. The more they talked, the more the doctor realized a profound truth. Countless healthcare workers had been sensing the same unexplainable phenomena for years but were too afraid to admit it. The hospital culture, focused on science, data, consistency, left no room for the spiritual, even when it was undeniably present. Yet every time someone shared their story, their shoulders relaxed, their breathing eased. It was as if unspoken experiences had been haunting them more than the experiences themselves. What struck the doctor most wasn't the variety of encounters, but the emotion behind them. Not fear, not confusion, but reverence. These professionals weren't describing horrors. They were describing moments of transition, presence, and inexplicable comfort. And in their eyes, the doctor saw something familiar, a longing to understand the sacredness woven into the work they did every day. It was then he realized that his gift wasn't an anomaly. It was a shared, hidden thread binding them all. And acknowledging it didn't weaken their profession, it deepened it. The idea didn't come from a committee, a policy meeting, or any official directive. It was born in a quiet moment between shifts, when the doctor and a small group of nurses realized they could no longer ignore what they were experiencing. Too many patients had passed with unfinished words. Too many families had arrived minutes too late. Too many final breaths had carried the weight of something unresolved. And because the doctor sensed approaching transitions before the monitors revealed them, the team saw an opportunity, one that could bring dignity where fear usually ruled. They began by creating a simple, discreet signal. If the doctor felt the familiar shift, a presence arriving early, the air thickening, a kind of spiritual gravity, the team would prepare gently, without alarming the patient or family. Lights were dimmed. Noise was minimized. The room was treated not as a place of medical decline, but as a sacred threshold. The goal wasn't to interfere with death, but to honor it. To ensure the moment wasn't a chaotic ending, but a conscious, compassionate passage. Soon, they added small but meaningful touches. A chair placed closer to the patient's bed so a family member could hold their hand without awkward distance. Soft music if the patient requested it earlier in their stay. A warm blanket to replace the cold, thin ones that too often made the final hours feel clinical. These details didn't change the medical outcome, but they transformed the emotional one. The team noticed that patients seemed more at peace, families less terrified, and the room itself felt calmer, as if the unseen presences approved. The protocol expanded organically. Staff members who had once been skeptical began participating after witnessing the impact. Even those who didn't sense the spiritual shifts trusted the doctor's intuition, because every time he gave the quiet signal, he was right. They learned to move in sync, to create a gentle choreography around the dying that honored both science and soul. It wasn't documented anywhere. It wasn't discussed publicly. But it became a shared understanding, something sacred, protected, and deeply human. In time, families began thanking them, not for prolonging life, but for softening the passage. They said things like, "It felt like she wasn't alone," or "something peaceful was in the room." And the doctor realized that this unspoken protocol was more than a reaction to his gift. It was a bridge between worlds. A way to ensure that even if the luminous presences were invisible to most, their compassion was felt by everyone. And once this protocol became part of the hospital's rhythm, nothing about their work, or their understanding of death, would ever be the same again. It happened on a night so quiet it felt like the hospital was holding its breath. The doctor had just finished checking on a patient in critical condition when he stepped into the hallway and froze. This time, the presence wasn't a single glow waiting patiently. There were seven luminous figures standing in a line along the corridor, each one radiating a distinct intensity, as if every presence carried a different story, a different purpose. For the first time, the doctor felt not just awe, but a kind of trembling reverence, as though he had stumbled into a sacred procession. The air felt charged, almost vibrating, as if the hallway itself had become a thin veil between two worlds. The doctor's instinct wasn't to run, but to bow his head, as though standing before something holy. These figures didn't move, didn't gesture. They simply waited, perfectly still. But the waiting held power. It felt intentional, coordinated, like they had arrived together for a single soul who needed more than just one guide for the journey ahead. The doctor had witnessed many presences before, but never a gathering. A nurse turned the corner abruptly and nearly dropped her clipboard. The shock on her face told the doctor she felt it too, the heavy, humming weight in the air, the sensation that the corridor wasn't empty despite looking so. She whispered, "What's happening?" But the doctor couldn't answer. Words felt too small. All he could do was watch the silent formation standing before room 12, where a patient who had been unconscious for days lay suspended between life and death. Moments later, the patient's daughter rushed in from the elevator, crying, apologizing for being late. As she entered the room, something shifted. One of the luminous figures seemed to lean slightly forward, as though acknowledging her presence. Then another. And another. It wasn't movement in the physical sense, but a subtle ripple, like light bending toward emotion. The doctor stood in the hallway, heart pounding, realizing the truth. These 7 weren't there for the dying man alone. They were there to support the woman who couldn't let go. When the patient finally took his final breath, the room filled with a profound stillness, deeper than anything the doctor had felt before. One by one, the 7 presences slowly faded, not disappearing abruptly, but dissolving into the air like embers cooling after a sacred fire. And as they left, the doctor sensed something unmistakable: unity, guidance, and an overwhelming compassion far beyond human understanding. It was the first time he realized that sometimes a soul doesn't leave alone, and sometimes it takes an entire circle of light to help someone cross gently. The doctor had handled loss before, but nothing prepared him for the day a 7-year-old boy was brought into the ICU. The child's small body looked even smaller against the vast hospital bed, wires and tubes surrounding him like a fragile constellation. His parents hovered close, gripping each other's hands with the desperation of people clinging to the last piece of a world slipping away. The doctor felt the familiar shift in the air, that quiet warning he had come to recognize, but this time it carried a tenderness so profound it made his chest tighten. When he stepped into the hallway, he felt it instantly, a presence, soft and warm, waiting by the child's door. But unlike the other encounters, this presence felt young, gentle, playful, even like a memory wrapped in light. The doctor swallowed hard. He knew what it meant. Yet this time, he couldn't bring himself to speak. How could he tell grieving parents that an unseen companion had already arrived to guide their son? Instead, he simply stayed with them, letting silence become a shelter rather than a void. As the hours passed, the doctor noticed something extraordinary. Whenever the child stirred or whispered incoherent words, the room seemed to brighten for a moment, as if responding to him. The parents sensed it too, though they couldn't explain why. The mother said softly, "It feels like someone is here with him." It wasn't a question. It was an instinct. And while the doctor couldn't reveal what he saw, he squeezed her hand to let her know she wasn't imagining it. Grief sharpens perception in its own mysterious way. In the child's final moments, something happened that the doctor would never forget. The boy opened his eyes, clear, bright, unafraid, and looked toward the corner of the room with a smile too peaceful for a child facing death. He reached out a tiny hand, as if greeting someone he knew, someone he trusted. Tears spilled down the doctor's face before he could stop them. The presence stepped closer, not in movement, but in feeling, wrapping the room in a warmth unlike anything he had ever known. The boy whispered, "I'm not scared," and closed his eyes. When the final breath left the boy's body, the entire room felt suspended in time. No alarms, no frantic energy, only a stillness so profound it felt sacred. The luminous presence lingered a moment longer, as if making sure the child transitioned gently, then faded in a slow, tender glow. The parents cried into each other's arms, but the doctor knew the truth. Their son had not left alone. And in that painful, sublime moment, he understood something deeper than any lesson in medicine. Love doesn't end at the edge of life. It continues, guiding, holding, leading forward. The girl was only 12, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived many lifetimes. She had been battling her illness quietly, bravely, and the doctor admired the way she always tried to comfort the adults around her instead of seeking comfort for herself. On the night her condition worsened, the doctor sensed the familiar shift, soft, warm, gentle. Two presences entered the room, luminous in a way that felt unmistakably comforting. But what startled him was how quickly the girl reacted, as if she had felt them arrive before he did. She turned her head toward the corner of the room and smiled, a real, bright smile that broke the doctor's heart. "Grandma," she whispered, lifting her hand slightly. Then, with a soft giggle that carried more joy than fear, she added, "And Uncle Louis, you came together." The doctor's breath caught. He saw the two presences clearly, but hearing her name them, without hesitation, without doubt, sent chills through him. Her parents, confused, followed her gaze, but their eyes met only empty air. Still, something about the stillness in the room made them hesitate before asking questions. Her mother knelt beside the bed, trembling. "Sweetheart, what do you see?" The girl didn't look away from the glowing silhouettes. "They're here to take me home," she said calmly, as though she were announcing something as simple as finishing a school assignment. There was no fear in her voice, only recognition, like a child running into familiar arms. The doctor felt the presences pulse gently, almost like a nod, and in that moment he understood. Children don't carry the same walls adults build. They see love before they see logic. As her breathing grew weaker, the girl reached out both hands, one toward each presence. Her eyes filled not with pain, but with belonging. "Can we go now?" she asked softly. Her father broke into a sound halfway between a sob and a plea, begging her to stay. But she touched his hand and whispered, "They've been waiting for me." The luminous forms grew brighter for a brief moment, filling the room with a warmth so pure it almost felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Even the parents felt something shift, an overwhelming peace settling over their fear. When the girl finally slipped away, the two presences didn't vanish abruptly. They remained, embracing the space around her, as if carrying her gently into a world just beyond the one everyone else could see. The parents cried, but their tears weren't of terror. They were of a bittersweet surrender to the unmistakable truth that love had arrived to guide their daughter. And as the light slowly faded, the doctor understood something he would carry forever. Children leave differently. They leave with trust, with clarity, and sometimes, with familiar hands waiting to walk them home. The doctor had witnessed presences before, but he had never seen what happened after the final breath. Not fully, not clearly. That changed on a quiet dawn when an elderly man, known for his gentle humor even in illness, took his last breaths. The room seemed to soften as the man drifted toward the end, the light from the window stretching across the floor in long, golden lines. The doctor stood beside him, prepared for the familiar shift, but what came next wasn't familiar at all. It was something deeper, something he instinctively knew he wasn't meant to witness, yet somehow was allowed to. The moment the man exhaled for the final time, the doctor felt the room expand, not physically, but in presence. The air thickened with a warmth that felt almost alive. And then, with a clarity that both stunned and humbled him, he saw a luminous shape rise slowly from the man's body. Not a dramatic departure, not a ghostly apparition, just a gentle unfurling of light, like a breath made visible. It hovered for a moment, still connected to the body below by a subtle, shimmering thread that pulsed like a heartbeat. What took his breath away wasn't the rising light, but the arrival of another. A luminous figure, familiar in its softness, appeared beside the unfolding spirit. This one radiated a distinct tenderness, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment for decades. The doctor couldn't see features, yet he felt an overwhelming sense of recognition from the new presence, as if it whispered, "You are safe. Come with me." The rising spirit responded not with movement, but with a shift of brightness, as though blooming in acknowledgement. The thread connecting body and spirit thinned, glowing brighter for a brief, breathtaking second. In that moment, the doctor felt something he couldn't explain, an emotion that wasn't his, a release so peaceful it felt like standing in warm rain after years of drought. And then, with unimaginable grace, the thread dissolved. The spirit drifted toward the waiting presence, their lights merging like two flames brought close until they became one. The doctor watched, unable to blink, feeling like he was witnessing a secret not meant for ordinary eyes. When the two presences finally faded, the room didn't feel empty. It felt honored, quiet, warm, cleansed by something sacred. The doctor stood there long after the monitors fell silent, trying to understand what he had just seen. It wasn't death. Not the version taught in textbooks. It was transition, gentle, guided, and deliberate. And from that moment on, he knew with absolute certainty that what he sensed wasn't merely intuition. It was connection, permission, a glimpse into the crossing itself. And it changed everything he believed about the boundary between here and beyond. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no hospital markings, just his name written in trembling handwriting. The doctor almost didn't open it, assuming it was another administrative notice or a family requesting medical records. But when he unfolded the paper and saw the uneven strokes, he recognized the emotion instantly. These were the parents of a patient he had stayed with during the final hours, a young mother whose passing had left the whole unit in silence for days. His throat tightened as he began to read. They wrote about how terrified they had been when they realized the end was near, how grief had made the world feel distorted and airless. But then, they said, something shifted, not in the medical outcome, but in the atmosphere. They described how he had dimmed the lights, moved the chairs closer, and encouraged them to talk to their daughter, not as a patient, but as their child. They mentioned how the room felt warm, how they sensed a presence even though they couldn't explain why. And they thanked him not for saving her life, but for helping them be present as she crossed the threshold. The letter went on to describe moments the doctor remembered vividly, the mother holding her daughter's hand and whispering stories from childhood, the father brushing her hair gently, the way the room seemed to soften as the family's love filled it. But the part that struck him hardest was when they wrote, "You made the last hours of her life feel like the first hours after she was born, full of love, full of light, full of us." He felt a sharp ache behind his eyes. He hadn't realized anyone else had felt the invisible presences that surrounded the room that night, but clearly, they had. Near the end of the letter, the parents revealed something they hadn't said in person, that just before their daughter took her final breath, they both felt as if someone gently placed a hand on each of their shoulders. They didn't know if it was imagination, grief, or something greater, but they felt calmer, steadier, less alone. And in that stillness, they found the strength to say goodbye without fear. "Whatever that was," the letter said, "we believe you helped make it possible." The doctor sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of their words. The final lines were the ones that stayed with him forever. "You didn't let her die. You helped her transition. And you helped us love her through every second of it." The doctor folded the letter slowly, holding it against his chest for a moment as if absorbing its warmth. It wasn't validation he sought, nor praise. It was the realization that his gift, once feared and suppressed, had become a bridge. A bridge between the living and the departing, between grief and peace. And this letter proved something he had long suspected. Love doesn't end at the final breath, it expands. The realization came slowly, like a pattern emerging only after enough pieces fit together. The doctor began noticing subtle cues in the people around him, glances that lingered too long on empty corners, pauses that suggested unspoken recognition, the quiet way some staff members reacted right before a patient's vitals changed. It wasn't coincidence. It was familiarity. Sensitivity, he realized, wasn't a rare anomaly that belonged only to him. It was something woven into the fabric of many people in the hospital, but rarely acknowledged and never spoken aloud. As he paid closer attention, he saw it everywhere. A nurse who always arrived at a room moments before a patient passed, claiming she just had a feeling. A janitor who said he avoided one hallway at night because it felt too crowded, even when it was empty. A physician who once muttered under his breath, "She's already gone," before the monitor flatlined. These weren't accidents. These were people brushing up against the same invisible world he had been navigating, yet each one believed they were alone in the experience. He started having quiet conversations, gentle questions asked in moments when the emotional air felt safe. And the responses were breathtakingly consistent. Every person hesitated, eyes darting away as if checking for judgment. But when he reassured them, when he shared a fragment of his own experiences, their shoulders dropped in relief. They confessed things they had buried for years, moments they were afraid to name, sensations they thought were signs of exhaustion or madness. But when they spoke, the more people opened up, the more he understood why this sensitivity had been hidden. The medical world prided itself on logic, control, measurable outcomes. Anything that slipped beyond those borders threatened the illusion of certainty that hospitals depended on. Admitting they sensed unseen presences felt like stepping into dangerous territory, a risk to reputation, to credibility, even to employment. And so these experiences lived in shadows, carried like secret burdens that no one dared to validate until the doctor made it safe. One night, after a particularly emotional shift, the doctor stood alone in a quiet corridor and felt something shift, not outside, but within himself. Sensitivity wasn't a curse, nor a miracle. It was a truth shared by many, hidden only because the world wasn't ready to accept it. But acceptance was growing, one whispered confession at a time. And in that moment, he understood something profound. When people finally admit what their souls have always known, the world between here and beyond becomes less divided and far less lonely. It happened during a night that felt strangely still, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. The doctor was walking down a dim corridor when he felt a presence, a familiar one, but stronger than any he had sensed before. It wasn't just a single guide or the gentle glow of a departing soul. This time, the presence filled the entire hallway with a soft, expansive light that seemed to bend the silence around him. He stopped walking, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the same instinct one feels when stepping into a sacred place. The presence didn't take shape the way others had. It wasn't a form, a silhouette, or a figure. It was something deeper, an overwhelming clarity, an understanding that flooded the doctor's mind without words. He felt a profound peace settle into his bones, a peace that didn't belong to the physical world. And then the message came. Not in sound, not in language, but in pure knowing. A knowing that vibrated through him like light passing through water. Death is not the end. It is only a door. The doctor felt his breath catch as images, not memories, but impressions, filled his mind. Moments of transition, moments he had witnessed but never fully understood, unfolded like a tapestry. The luminous presences guiding the dying. The peaceful reunions. The warmth that filled rooms during a final breath. He saw them not as isolated events, but as steps along the same path, a passage, a threshold, an opening. And for the first time, he understood that death wasn't an abrupt ending. It was a continuation, a movement, a return. The presence seemed to pulse gently, as if affirming his realization. The doctor felt tears gather in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of the truth settling within him. All the fear he once had, all the confusion, the doubt, the struggle between logic and intuition, it melted away. He realized that every spirit he had seen was not a symbol of ending, but of connection. Every presence was there to guide, not to take. Every crossing was not a loss, but an arrival somewhere beyond sight. And then, just as softly as it had come, the presence receded. The light dimmed back into the ordinary glow of the hospital corridor. But the doctor remained still, breathing differently, seeing the world differently. He knew, with a certainty deeper than anything he had learned in medicine, that what lay beyond the final breath was not darkness, but passage. Not silence, but continuity. And from that night forward, every farewell he witnessed carried a new meaning, a quiet, profound truth he would whisper in his heart. No one truly ends. They simply walk through a door we cannot follow. In the end, the doctor didn't just witness death, he witnessed what comes before it, what walks beside it, and what waits beyond it. He learned that every final moment carries a story, a presence, a gentle guidance that no machine can measure. And through every patient, every family, every luminous figure, he discovered a truth that changed not only his career, but his soul. What he saw wasn't darkness. It wasn't emptiness. It wasn't an ending. It was transition, connection, continuation. A doorway that opens when the world thinks it closes. And now, after everything you've heard, ask yourself, have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? Do you believe someone comes for us at the end? Do you think sensitivity like his is a gift or a burden? Tell me in the comments. Your story might be the next one that helps someone heal. If this video touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Share this with someone who needs comfort, clarity, or simply a reminder that love doesn't end, transforms. And remember, death is not the end. It is only a door, and no one walks through it alone. Spoke, their voices trembled not with fear, but with release.